Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? We'll begin with news on the use of rapid antibody testing for the Ccp virus. In general, these test kits are very quick, very easily done, and require little to no training to execute. This means they are very useful for frontline testing of people. It provides a fast turnaround and often in less than half an hour. This will give you some indication as to whether or not somebody might be recently infected or currently infected with the Ccp virus. One of the ongoing concerns with them has been that they are notoriously inaccurate. Think of them as being similar to a pregnancy test. Urinate on the stick, wait, and see a result. In a similar manner, the rapid tests for the Ccp virus do something similar, but with blood. Research into this indicates that, although they're notoriously inaccurate, they may be even more inaccurate than initially thought. The test that is being investigated in this research has the company responsible for its manufacture claiming above a 97% accuracy rating. That this accuracy rating is then just above 92% when you confirm with DNA testing. The researchers examined these claims and then run the same sort of testing and found it drops down to a little over 84%. Now remember, these are very quick tests, and they are, for lack of a better description, quick and dirty. That means they're done easily, cheaply, and quickly. They can be run in bulk. They're bought for very little and distributed on a very large scale. DNA testing, by comparison, often requires at least some degree of training, often takes hours at best and often days, and is also comparably far more expensive to do. This sort of information is very important when we start looking at what information is being used to try and establish the population level of infection. In past weeks, What Were They Thinking? We've mentioned that some states in America rely on these test statistics and incorporate them into the whole number. Other states have them as a separate category, and some states don't indicate how many people have been positively tested with these disposable kits. If you are trying to extrapolate how much the population is infected, these sorts of results, even if they're inaccurate, are one of the foundations used to figure out those sorts of numbers. Knowing their accuracy rating allows you to give a confidence interval that more reliably indicates just what is happening where and when. This is especially true with our next news item, where there is concern that the figures for the Ccp virus could be significantly higher than what the official numbers are telling. Research from a number of countries, including the United States of America, Australia, Canada, South Korea, and a number of European countries, has led researchers to believe that actual figures of Ccp virus infection could be six-fold what is being listed as the current official number. The way this works is very different to the normal modeling. Most people are familiar with the idea of a linear model where you take the currently available data and try to predict into the future. In this case, the scientists took the opposite approach. They took the data available now, specifically the number of daily fatalities, and then tried to figure out how many infections would be necessary to get to this number in the past. This reverse means of establishing the number of infections that existed before the number of fatalities allows them to avoid some of the current issues, particularly the data around who has been infected and how. The same sort of data that we're looking at when it comes from the measurement of disposable kits and DNA testing, often this being epidemiological and serological. As we just said, often these tests can either not provide enough coverage because of cost, feasibility, and ability to deploy limitations, or the tests themselves have serious limitations in their confidence. This means that the data extracted from that can at times be unreliable. Not unreliable in that the data that we have is incorrect, only that it has not captured the whole available dataset available. And that's where these particular versions or approaches to data analysis can come in useful. It supports what we already suspected, but it also allows us to figure out what is happening. The researchers noted that their method allowed for a better indication of what was happening, but it also was very dependent on the accuracy and reliability of reporting from different countries. The researchers give two very startling examples. The first being South Korea. South Korea has been repeatedly described as the epitome of an effective system for both finding people who have been infected and controlling the spread of the infection. The researchers found that their backcasting infection rate was only 2.6 times higher than what their official figures held. By contrast, Italy has been one of the more significantly impacted countries, and the backcasting method indicated that they had 17.5 times more infections than their official numbers indicated. It's worth noting with this study that the data used came from mostly developed, wealthy nations. This means countries that were not only able to afford, but had deployed widespread and effective nets to capture the data that was needed. Trying to apply this method to other countries, for example, China or India, where numbers are very different, would be very difficult to say the least. The method, whilst effective, robust, and simple, isn't able to work where the data is not available and the data is not reliable. Talking about various countries, and particularly developed countries, places like America, Australia, Canada, and Europe tend to have most of their population concentrated into large cities. Research using simulations that take the currently available data indicates that people leaving large cities and heading to smaller towns and the country tend to be better than trying to shut down borders and initiate a hard lockdown. The concept itself is hardly new. Historically, when plague broke out in cities, many people would try to escape to the country. They would leave the cities themselves before the lockdown came into effect and try to set up somewhere further out in the country. They understood that when disease spread, it spread very quickly inside large cities with concentrated populations. Taking modern epidemiology and applying the same idea, we can use the calculation that are available. These involve the susceptible, the infected, and recovered, the SIR model. When you take this and you look at migration of people, taking a sample size, or in this case a simulated sample size, you can figure out whether or not it's better to have a low population density or a high population density, and just how much impact this has on the spread of a disease like the CCP virus. The obvious impact from this that everybody can predict is that if you suddenly increase the population in somewhere outside of metropolitan cities, you will see the infection rate go up. But what's interesting is that the relative decrease to the densely populated metropolitan areas or big cities went down far more than you would anticipate. Their model found that allowing people to move out of the large city that had 90% of the population took the infection rate from 35% to 23%. Of course, the research here also replicates findings from history. Generally speaking, those who managed to escape the cities when plague was starting out would remain as far away from the cities as possible in holiday homes or retreats until the plague ended. And this is exactly what the research here indicates should be done as well. Allowing people to leave large, densely populated cities and go to holiday homes or similar, far away from densely populated centers, and leaving them there until the outbreak ended was more effective than letting them return at some point. This was very similar to a one-way gate. Once you leave, you're out permanently. Keeping that in mind, this was all done with a model based on predictable rules. As everybody knows, humans are at least not predictable. This information is useful, but then we need to consider what the real-world evidence shows. Basing this on the available data, particularly in America, American states that have imposed few restrictions claim that they had the best results during the first wave, and this may be a viable argument. The problem is the second wave. When they've continued with the same limited restrictions, states that imposed few restrictions on the movement and actions of people are now seeing some of the most significant increases during the second wave of infection. This obviously creates a problem. Their systems, while they may have worked the first time, appear to not be up to scratch the second time. This is best exemplified by this image showing the tightest control measures, intermediate control measures, and fewest control measures. Data obtained between the start of March and the middle of November demonstrates that the states with fewest control measures have seen the most significant spikes. In this visualization, you can see how most of the states begin quite close together, but that over time, those with fewest restrictions wind up with the highest average cases per 100,000. Understand, these standardized numbers are the best way to go about it. Some states obviously having far higher populations than others. When we start looking at how many cases per capita, we can far more effectively understand whether or not what they're doing works, despite the discrepancies in population. These figures should be driven home by the next story. 1 in every 1,000 people who live in North Dakota have been killed by the Ccp virus. Let that sink in for a moment. 1 in every 1,000. The control measures in North Dakota are one of the states where they were relaxed most significantly, and they currently have one of the highest infection rates. This may explain why they are being hit in one of the hardest ways possible. The very high infection rates across America may carry one very thin silver lining. It is possible, based on data coming out of an Oxford study, that immunity to the Ccp virus may last for at least 6 months after infection. Now, this needs to be balanced carefully against the continued examples of reinfection that are being reported. The data looked at a little over 11,000 employees in the British healthcare system. 89 of these developed antibodies after being infected by the Ccp virus. There were also over 1,200 employees who developed antibodies, but also demonstrated symptoms. This means that there was a large group of people who had been infected, and then they were able to follow them and find out what was happening. Those who had antibodies could contract the virus, but they may not demonstrate symptoms. There were only 3 who contracted the virus, had antibodies, and did not develop symptoms. This is useful information not just for those who are working in the healthcare sector and as a result at very high risk of infection, but it also raises a second possibility that we need to be very aware of. Vaccines that rely on development of antibodies to the virus may need to be given a booster 6 months afterwards. The Conversation has recently published an article looking at just this, particularly with the possibility of Pfizer and Moderna both bringing out vaccines, if not in the next few weeks, certainly before the end of the year. The article looks at how a vaccine might be used in the real world and how the numbers would stack up. One of the big issues is that the world is coming up on 8 billion people. Some of the largest countries in the world, India and China, have more than 1 billion people in each. The issue is countries like India and China need to be able to develop and deploy their vaccines effectively. Countries like America that have over 300 million people tend to have more facilities and more companies dedicated to the production of these sorts of things, and so they're likely to see the benefits of a vaccine first. Then we need to consider the issues of how they actually go and deploy the vaccine. Logistically, some of these vaccines need to be moved and stored at incredibly low temperatures. Getting them to places that are isolated, regional, or rural may not be an option. They may not have the facilities to store them, and they may even have a reticence to take up the vaccine. This means that by the time the vaccine gets to where it needs to be, it may be spoiled. It may not be able to be stored on site and therefore become spoiled. And the community itself may not want the vaccine. In other cases, we need to look at places like the United Kingdom. They're ordering 40 million doses of the Perfisa vaccine, which requires 2 doses. That means there's 20 million people who will be able to receive it. Of these, it seems the majority of those vaccinations are intended for people aged 55 and over. If we're talking about 55-year-olds being given the vaccine, then largely we're going to be ignoring the younger people. And based on the current research, there's a possibility that young people may be impacted in other ways in the long term if they are infected. This is not a herd immunity strategy. This is a triage strategy intended to minimize the immediate harm from the virus, that being the very large mortality rate among older people. This would also give the United Kingdom an opportunity to be able to support younger people in hospital. In another article from The Conversation, the author talks about why it's important that we now have 2 candidates. Both Pfizer and Moderna have passed, in their opinion, the necessary hurdles to be approved as an intervention for the Ccp virus and have their vaccine approved. Some of the biggest concerns when it comes to these 2 and the other vaccines that are still in the pipeline are that they've been developed at incredibly fast speed. They've been largely funded by the government, and the approval is done under an emergency allowance. This is irregular, to say the least. Despite this, they have had to follow all of the normal clinical processes, which is one reason why we can at least trust the results at the moment. Among other issues is that they've been running these clinical trials with thousands and thousands of people. Often these trials have tens of thousands. This means that any negative results should show up very quickly, particularly adverse reactions. Not only that, but it's now a requirement for clinical trials to publish their data and make it available for other scientists to go through and scrutinize. With that in mind, what we're seeing now should be very well established technology with a proven track record, normal clinical trial procedures, and data that has been pored over for any discrepancies. The article from The Conversation goes into 5 other points that are worth considering when you're thinking about the vaccines and the candidates that we both have now and the increasing number we'll have very soon. While on the topic of vaccines, we mentioned that there are 2, and we've only spoken about the Perfisa vaccine so far. One of the concerns we have about that vaccine is that it's 90% effective, but they haven't provided a lot of data just yet. The second option is the Moderna vaccine. The Moderna vaccine claims a nearly 95% efficacy rate. That's a significant jump on what the Perfisa vaccine claims. And we now need to look at what they're measuring and how. As we've said, the vaccines often at this point of a clinical trial are involving tens of thousands of people. In this case, 30,000 people. Some of the advantages of this vaccine over the others is that it doesn't require the same technical storage. To be clear, this can be kept in a standard refrigerator and stored for about a month. The other option needs to be stored in a very tightly controlled freezer at a very low temperature, well beyond what the standard consumer can expect to be able to get their hands on. The concern with this vaccine is that 10% of participants who had it experienced severe fatigue. The fatigue in some respects is not that unexpected, particularly when we're talking about what the body's doing in the process of being immunized. It's rallying the immune system and expecting the body to be tired after trying to rouse itself to defense is not unexpected, but certainly not unpleasant. The bigger consideration is, would you rather have short-term fatigue or long-term mortality rates that are very high? Either way, we should expect to see mortality rates remain high for a time, even if this vaccine is given approval. The reason for this is simple. It took us decades to eradicate some of the other vaccinated diseases that are out there, and it will take us at least 5 years to roll out immunization for the whole world. In that time, we can expect to see a variety of issues come up. While we're still on the topic of vaccines, we've mentioned that there were two, Perfisa and Moderna. Moderna's looking to apply for its vaccine approval, but Perfisa has now applied for it. This means that it's possible that within days, the FDA may approve distribution of their vaccine within America. It would be reasonable to anticipate that shortly thereafter Perfisa would seek similar approval in other countries. In the process of getting this approval, Perfisa has made more of the necessary data available. Some of this data is more interesting than others. To start with, they had 170 patients become sick during the trial. 10 of them developed a severe case of the Ccp virus. 9 of these were in the placebo group and only 1 in the vaccination group. Next is that it was overall very well tolerated, although as with the Moderna vaccine, there were issues with severe fatigue. Interestingly though, older patients seemed to have fewer side effects and they were generally more mild than younger people involved in the study. Normally you'd expect to see this the other way around. Going from the good news of a vaccine to strange and unusual news. Children are developing antibodies to the Ccp virus, but they do not test positive for being infected by it. This comes from a very, very small example of a family where both parents were both exposing children to the virus for nearly 2 weeks, while being positive to the Ccp virus themselves. Yet the children did not test positive. More than that, despite not having a nucleic positive test, the children continuously were identified as having antibodies specific to the Ccp virus in their saliva. This means that it appears the children had never been able to be positively tested for the virus, but that the virus had somehow triggered an immunological response in them that had caused them to become immune, or at least very resistant to the virus. Having spent so much time so far on the Ccp virus, we can go now to interesting news that's not related to it, particularly ancient news and archaeological news. Exploration of a necropolis in Egypt has produced more than 100 sealed coffins. These coffins are more than 2,500 years old. One of the things that comes from this is that by opening these sarcophagi, archaeologists are able to find out a lot of information as the remains have been preserved exceptionally well. Things like burial shrouds still have clear images that are well coloured. This means that they can discover not just information about the culture of the time, but also theoretically conduct things like chemical testing to understand what was being used at that period to get an understanding of the industry of the period and place. In clinically relevant news, researchers have been able to, at least theoretically, reverse aging. In practice, this was only possible at a cellular level. If you are familiar with biology, you would understand that every time your DNA is replicated, there are small caps at the end known as telomeres. These telomeres are what are theoretically meant to keep the DNA strand and the chromosome as a whole nice and tightly held together. Every time the chromosome is opened up to be replicated, these telomeres shorten a little bit. When they finally get to a limited point, the cells are no longer able to function, but as they shorten, they get a higher and higher risk of things like cancer developing. In order for these telomeres to shorten, the most common approach is either damage or aging. This is one reason why telomeres are considered one of the better indicators of age at a cellular level. Theoretically, if you can extend the telomeres, you can keep cells stable and safe and minimize the chances of cancer associated with telomere shortening for as long as possible. What happened in this very small and underpowered study was 26 patients were put into a hyperbaric oxygen chamber. This happened 5 days a week for 90 minutes. This proceeded to go on for 3 months. At the end of the 3 months, their cell telomere length was measured, and it was 20% more than when they began. In other clinically relevant news, scientists have spent a lot of time trying to discover various ways to treat injuries. This can include antibiotics, different treatment patterns, things like use of silver in bandages. While some of these are marketing gimmicks, others are necessary. One that is currently being looked at is the use of particular gels in injuries. The gels intended for more significant injuries will help heal the wounds. The general term for these is hydrogel, and the idea is you get the immune system and body healing quickly. This is then going to help to reduce the amount of scarring that occurs. Consider what happens when you get something like a large injury due to burns, car accidents, and so on. These all generate large amounts of damage to the body, and what follows is a large amount of scar tissue. Scar tissue impinges on the ability to use limbs effectively. Breathing often causes long-term pain, and so on. If you can more effectively cause the body to heal and minimize that scarring, you should, at least in theory, be able to reduce the amount of problems that are associated with recovery from serious injuries. The researchers involved in this study were trying to shift the burden from the immune system from removing damaged tissue and forming scar tissue to instead replacing lost cells, and, in the case of a burn, recovering skin cells. The researchers were able to get this different outcome by instead altering the structure of what they were using for the gel. What was interesting was that in their efforts to try and make the gel stay there for longer and encourage the immune system's activity, they instead activated a different set of immune cells. This different set of immune cells were what were responsible for the recovery of functional tissue instead of scar tissue. While thinking about biology, we're now going to move on to the tech industry, particularly the development of new computer chips that are, in a manner of speaking, similar to our brain, or particularly biologically how our brain functions at a neuron level. The human brain is essentially a giant squishy ball of yarn. The yarn is all tangled together, and each small section is a neuron. It interacts and communicates, but despite the seeming chaos that is the brain, it is broken up into specific functional regions. This is what allows the brain to do many different things at the same time. Your heart beats, you breathe, we're talking, any number of things that might interfere with other sections if it was just one single homogeneous structure. While doing this, it still remembers all the necessary information. This is where the new chip design comes in. The chip is designed in such a way that not only can it compute, but it can store, or at least remember, the things that it's computing and acts as a memory bank. This is combining the idea of a CPU and a hard drive into one device. Among the advantages to designing the technology this way is that it reduces the energy requirements for it to function. When you consider the wide variety of devices that would be in your home, whether this is your phone, computer, laptop, TV, fridge, and so on, each of them has an energy demand, and if they're a smart device, that energy demand would be higher. Try scaling this up to your town. Your town has street lights, traffic lights, signage. All of these require energy, and if they're systems that are integrated into a decision-making system, such as for the control of the flow of traffic, having it all in one device would make the system more efficient and allow for the more effective utilization of these systems. While still in the area of technology, we need to talk about some old technology that's been in some of our recent videos. The Arecibo telescope. The Arecibo telescope is a very large radio telescope. The large and obvious part that keeps coming up in the news has been a 300-meter wide dish. The dish has recently had 2 cables break. These 2 cables are broken in such a way that they've caused damage to the dish. That's led the authority responsible for trying to figure out just what to do with it. The National Science Foundation has had to have engineers go in there and figure out how they're going to fix it. The engineers have now reported back with the simple assessment that it can't be fixed safely. As a result, the National Science Foundation now needs to decommission it. Decommissioning not only a 300-meter wide dish, but the receiver held above it on wires is going to be a bit of a problem. The receiver is held on 3 large towers. Underneath this is the dish. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you might have below.